The American frontier was a perfect place for the blending of cultures. Food, language, clothing, and music were all part of people's daily lives, and they traveled back and forth across cultural boundaries. Today on the Deerskin Diary, we're going to look at one indigenous food source, the hickory nut, and how it went from frontier flora to indigenous hearths to Euro-American journals and taste notes. So stick around. This is one nutty journey, and I know you're not going to want to miss it. Now, the hickory tree itself comes from the genus Correa, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the word hickory itself likely comes from an indigenous language. The wood from the hickory tree provided bow wood, it provided wood for blowgun darts and things like ball playing sticks and a number of other items. But it was the tree nut itself that gave the hickory tree its tremendous value. Indigenous cultures throughout North America valued the hickory nut. We know this because of oral tradition, the written journals from Euro-Americans, passed down culinary practices, and archaeological evidence. Nut processing occurred at high rates at several archaeological sites in what we now know to be the American frontier. Hickory nuts, black walnuts, and acorns represented the majority of early nut gathering and processing for human consumption. This process generally occurred in the fall when parties went out to gather these food sources. Of note is that nuts as a food source were generally known to be from people bringing food back to a main village area rather than the nomadic lifestyle that occurs when following animals for food. Now, this was an important distinction because it means that the presence of the hickory trees themselves would indicate some sort of landmark in the interior of their lands. And these landmarks likely led to paths and traces, much like salt licks would, that eventually shaped the way people moved throughout the land. Remember, everything in history is a combination of cultures and landscapes. Hickory nuts provide valuable fats and carbohydrates while requiring minimal processing. Unlike acorns that have to be shelled and boiled, hickory nuts only have to be shelled and kept in a cool, dry place in order to remain edible. According to the USDA, 1 cup of hickory nuts has a whopping 788 calories, 77 grams of total fats, and 15 grams of protein. And in scientific terms, for a wild food, that's nuts. Historically, the nuts were gathered in the late summer or early fall. Timing was, and is, important here as the nuts are best gathered when they fall naturally and begin to separate themselves from the outer hulls. When enough nuts were gathered, they could be stored as is in a cool, dry place for a few months or processed into nut milk or even turned into hickory oil. In modern times, it's best to keep them in the freezer. Historically, several Europeans described their encounters with hickory foods while visiting or living with indigenous tribes. Naturalist and explorer William Bartram wrote that, quote, "I have seen above 100 bushels of these nuts belonging to one family. They pound them to pieces and then cast them into boiling water, which, after passing through fine strainers, preserves the most oily part of the liquid. This they call by a name which signifies hickory milk. It is as sweet and rich as fresh cream, and is an ingredient in most of their cookery, especially hominy and corn cakes." Now, Benjamin Hawkins was an Indian agent with the Muskogee Creek down in Georgia. He actually mentions hickory foods with the Creeks twice, noting first that in 1796, quote, "They sent me a present of bean bread and dumplings, some oil of hickory nuts pleasant to the taste, and some milk of the same nuts." Later, in February of 1797, he describes that, quote, "They were both at home, received me and treated me with attention. They had ready for me some potatoes, hickory milk, pumpkin and beans, and hickory nut oil, ground peas, and chestnuts." Now, this quote inadvertently reveals some of the storage longevity of these nuts. You see, the quote occurs in February, but the nuts were likely gathered the previous fall. But perhaps Irish native and Indian trader James Adair described the process best when he wrote that, quote, "They have a great deal of fruit, and they dry such kinds as will bear it. At the fall of the leaf they gather a number of hickory nuts, which they pound with a round stone upon a stone thick and hollowed for the purpose. When they are beat fine enough, they mix them with cold water in a clay basin, where the shells subside. The other part is an oily, tough, thick, white substance called by the traders hickory milk, and by the Indians the flesh or fat of hickory nuts, with which they eat their bread. A hardy stranger would be as apt to dip into the sediments as I did the first time this vegetable thick milk was set before me. As ranging the woods had given me a keen appetite, I was the more readily tempted to believe they only tantalized me for their diversion, when they laughed heartily at my supposed ignorance. Luckily, when the basin was in danger, the bread was brought in piping hot, and the good-natured landlady, being informed of my simplicity, showed me the right way to use the vegetable liquid. To make hickory milk today, I used the same basic process. I gathered the nuts in the fall and removed the outer husks. I cracked the nuts with a stone I made for this purpose, and then I use a food processor in modern times to get the even, fine consistency. I don't quite have all the tools yet that they had back then to make this process fully 18th century. And from there, I add water to cover and bring it to a boil for about 10 minutes. After that, I strain the mixture through a coarse strainer and return it to a simmer. As it starts to reduce, I remove it from the heat and strain it through a finer strainer sometimes, although it's not really necessary. Most of the tougher, larger holes already sink to the bottom, and if you're careful, you can just pour it into a cup right off the top. Now, after it's strained and all done, you can drink it as is, which is what I do, or you can add sugar. All right, here it is, hickory milk. Let's give it a shot. Rich, oily, and fatty. Boy, it's very filling. Honestly, you can keep your pumpkin spice. This, to me, is a true taste of fall. A little sugar would definitely set it off. I can see where this would be absolutely delicious in a rice pudding or something like that, or a sweet cornmeal. Just the fattiness. What do you think?
It's good.
Yeah, I think so too. Definitely worth the time and the effort, I'd say. And I can see why this was such an important beverage to indigenous tribes and something that they shared with Euro-Americans, because I mean, I can already feel myself starting to get kind of full just based on the fattiness and stuff that's in here. And it's just, you can see the oil. I can't get it on camera, unfortunately, but you can see the oil just sort of floating around on the surface. So, wow, the power of the hickory nut. Something you want to try again? Now, as a note here, I use the shagbark hickory nut, which is what indigenous cultures used as well, and it's the one that you will want to use also. There's a bitter nut hickory, and I've got a front yard full of those. They produce, quite frankly, an annoying amount of hickory nuts that aren't really good for much. The flavor is just way too strong. Not good for what we're doing here. The hickory nut, something that today is driven over on roadways and driveways and trampled underfoot, little revealing how important it was as an indigenous food source. Its flavor was so noteworthy it was written about by several Euro-Americans. It's also a very easy dish for you to try at home and perhaps even connect a little more with your history through your taste buds, so give it a try. And thanks for giving this channel a try and your continued kind words of encouragement and support. They are driving more videos. And on that note, we'll see you next time on the Deerskin Diary.